Hi everybody. So I'm going to go ahead and apologize. I have strep throat and I'm feeling terrible, but I'm going to try to power through this, okay? All right, so for my FBA presentation, I chose a student and I'm calling him Brian. He is very active in the classroom, uh, just kind of all over the place. Um, Anyways, we'll get started. All right, so Brian does not have an IEP, but was diagnosed with a sleeping disorder when he was in kindergarten, and has been on ADHD medication previously. His mom decided to take him off of that medication um, for, from what I understand, are unknown reasons. Um, he also has a really hard time sleeping. He's usually up half the night. Um, so Anyways, that's Brian as like from a medical standpoint, I guess, from what I know about him. He's in the general education classroom. He doesn't receive any outside resources as far as like going to the resource room or anything like that. He's in the third grade and he's 8 years old. Um, English is Brian's first language. He's very high functioning. He's very smart. Um, Brian has multiple behaviors. Most seem to be socially reinforced, but I only observed one day of those behaviors, so I didn't really choose to observe those for this project. Um, and they weren't really as um, much of a concern, I don't think, to his teacher either. So in his classroom, Mrs. Brown has several students with IEPs. And so she does her best to kind of accommodate Brian's needs outside of him not having an IEP. He has a spiky tactile cushion. It's those cushions with like the little spikes on it that bounces and all of that. And he has a bouncy band for his feet. Brian sits in the desk nearest to his teacher, but is furthest away from her during instruction time. So, where his spot in the classroom is, her desk is back here. He sits right here, and she's way up here doing instruction. And so it's kind of interesting to see that play out. Um, so yeah, so operational definition. Brian is off task, meaning he plays with objects on his desk or in his desk, gets out of his chair, talks to classmates, or inactively sits at his desk without following instructions given by his teacher 42% of the time. Most of the time when I was observing, it was math time, but there were a few observations that I did where it was not math time, and it was still pretty consistent with um, what I observed during math time. So, all right, interview data. First of all, the data I got from understanding where he's at as far as like the sleep disorder and all of that, that information came from this interview. Additional behaviors that he tends to show in the classroom are aggression, property destruction, and other disruptive behaviors that disrupt learning time for Mrs. Brown in her class. So the scores, the social attention and preferred items, he got a 4. Social and escape from task activities, he got a 2. And automatic sensory stimulation, he got a 4. Automatic pain attenuation, he got a 1. Um, so as you can see, the social attention and preferred items and the automatic sensory stimulation are super high, and they're also tied with each other. So that kind of goes back to me saying, he does have a lot of social attention behaviors, but not really related to being off task. And that's kind of what I focused on the most was his off task behavior. Um, when I asked Mrs. Brown about his off task behavior because she tended to focus a lot on the aggression and property destruction and disruptive behaviors. She didn't seem as concerned about the off task behavior, which I thought was interesting because that's um, what, for me as a teacher, would set off alarms, even though obviously aggression and property destruction are huge issues. Those definitely should be examined, but as far as what I watched, it was the off task. she said that whenever she asks him to stay on task or gives him any sort of consequence for not being on task, um, excuse me, that's when aggression and property destruction kick in. And so I think I think that she sometimes doesn't address the off-task behavior because she doesn't want the aggression. But obviously, I can't speak for that. So before I talk, or after I talked to her, my provisional hypothesis was that Brian was participating in off-task behavior in order to escape from doing assignments. Um, that was just kind of my thinking. Other observation data, I did the time monitoring observation, which is the one that most people didn't really get a lot of information for. I actually did get a lot of information on him, and as far as the class went, so that was kind of interesting. Although I don't really think that it gives enough information to diagnose anything, especially for Brian. Um, but it was pretty interesting to sit for 15 minutes and compare him to other students in the classroom. Um, he was only on task for a minute and 30 seconds out of the 15 minutes. So, and all of this was instruction or guided instruction time. So there wasn't really a lot of individual work, but you can see that he was not really paying attention at all while she was teaching. And he was only addressed for 40 seconds out of those 15 minutes for not being on task. And during those 40 seconds, he was given positive interactions. So she was sitting beside him and saying positive things and all of that. And for 10 seconds after she was saying positive things, um, he was doing the work. But as soon as she was out of the area, he was right back to playing with his pencils and um, just kind of sitting there and not doing the work. Um, Compared to other students in his class, he um, most of the students were on task while I was watching them. There were a couple students that um, had like 30 seconds where they were told that they needed to be on task by Mrs. Brown, and they went on to be on task during the rest of that time period. So during the percentage of opportunities, he was off task 42% of the time. Um, and that was during a math lesson. So, um, as you can see, about 50%. It's pretty out of hand. Um, okay, so some additional information. ABC observation, he exhibited behaviors that seemed to be socially reinforced. He would go to the sink and wet a paper towel and then throw it into the trash can and look around for anybody that might be watching, including myself. Um, he wasn't really um, he wasn't really given attention for those things. But it was it was like even just the watching reinforced that kind of behavior, just watching for people that might be paying attention to him. And when he wasn't given attention for it, he seemed to try other things. So, most likely to occur versus least likely to occur for off-task behavior. Most likely to occur in the morning when Brian first arrives to school. Mrs. Brown says he's always sleepy and just dragging his feet. And the second anybody asks him to do anything related to schoolwork, he usually gets aggressive and she says he throws an all-out fit, quote unquote. So, um, most likely to occur then. I didn't observe any aggressive behavior. Of course, because of my class schedule and work and everything, I was most likely to come when it's least likely to occur, which is after lunch and recess. So, there's that. But he was still off task for the majority of that time that I watched him. My FBA statement is Brian participates in off-task behavior, meaning he plays with objects on his desk or in his desk, gets out of his chair, talks to classmates, or inactively sits at his desk without following instructions given by his teacher 42% of the time. The function of Brian's off-task behavior appears to be sensory stimulation. Um, So my justification, when reminded to be off the sorry for the typo, when reminded to be on task, Brian seems to work only while Mrs. Brown is near him, but soon goes back to playing with writing utensils or appears inactive and off task. So kind of what I was saying earlier, if Mrs. Brown was with him for like 30 seconds, and then 10 seconds after that he was on task. Seconds she was away, he was back to playing with his pencils and all of that. Excuse me again. He doesn't seem to be socially reinforced for being off task. Anytime Mrs. Brown was talking to him and asked him to do anything, it didn't really change his behavior. Classmates don't really pay attention to his off task behavior. Every now and then he would make a comment to a classmate and they would maybe laugh for a second, but again, it didn't seem to be socially reinforced because the majority of the time he didn't seek for that socially reinforced behavior. Like he didn't seek for the social automatic um, of that. So I'm sorry, my brain is fried. I am not feeling good. Oh my gosh. Okay. Um, so he doesn't gain tangibles from being on task. I've never seen him like I've never seen Mrs. Brown say, "Hey Brian, you get a couple points for being on task" or anything like that. Um, so uh, I don't think that's part of that. Um, Mrs. Brown's intervention with the tactile chair cushion and the bouncy band for his chair doesn't really seem to help him stay on task. In fact, he doesn't really seem to interact with those two objects at all. It seems to me that he's constantly just doing this with pencils or, rolling them on his desk or whatever. He's usually doing something with his hands. And so I think that those are great interventions, but they're not really helping him. And this kind of goes back to earlier, me saying that um, I'm sorry, my provisional hypothesis was him being off task to escape doing assignments, which he doesn't do the assignments, so he is in fact escaping them, but there's no really outside force helping him to escape it other than maybe Mrs. Brown doesn't say anything to him enough or spend enough time beside him to keep him on task. Um, but he doesn't seem to actually have, like, his behaviors don't influence the environment enough to where that's the problem. I think honestly that it's just he is, whoops. Um, I think he just simply is able to get the stimulus from playing with his hand, doing things with his hands. And so um, that's my hypothesis, is that it's completely stimulus related. Um, so yeah, that's Brian. Like I said, the socially reinforced, he's not really reinforced by those things. At least it doesn't appear that he is. Classmates really don't pay that much attention to Brian. Um, and neither does Mrs. Brown really. And so yeah, I think it's just the stimulus. And I think that if he was given something where he could, like clay or something, where he could squeeze it while he worked or something and get the training to be able to do that, I think that he would drastically improve on his on task behavior. Thanks.